Kian de los Santos, matao na kinota lang o sinama lang sa kota para lang may pakita ang administration when it comes to their drug war. Former Senator Leila de Lima, who spent more than half a decade behind bars on trumped-up charges. Remember, scandals around DOH, Farmali, COVID-19 expenditures of the government, some would say overpriced vaccines, the price of the PPEs, and all sorts of different anomalous activities that very much put into question the good governance claims of the administration. The Philippines spent billions of dollars dun sa mga flood control projects na clearly hindi effective as we saw with recent typhoons and inability of our infrastructure to cope with it. Guess what? A lot of that was spent during the 6 years of Rodrigo Duterte. Next thing you know, there's an explosion of kidnapping. Next thing you know, there's an explosion of scamming. So let's be honest, who really benefited from the Pogos when they were here, aside from their own Chinese operators? Kailan lang tinawag si former President Rodrigo Duterte as a one-man fake news factory. That makes sense. But in many ways, mas accurate na tawagin siyang Budol King. Let's look at the data and the actual Duterte legacy.
The President of the Republic of the Philippines, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte.
Pagdating sa Duterte legacy, may dalawang dimensions, domestic and international. Unang-una, pag-usapan natin yung domestic aspects of Duterte's legacy. Simulan naman tayo dyan sa drug war. Or to be specific, yung pangako ni Duterte na within 3 to 6 months, he's gonna rid the country of criminality, drugs, and all sorts of problems. Pero, parang japix. Huwag natin kalimutan si Pangulong Duterte himself on multiple occasions, inadmit niya, na palpak yung kanyang drug war.
Sinasabi ko, I can clean it in 6 months. And after that, I realized na nagkamali talaga ako.
After all, way into his 6-year term in office, mukhang he was not able to show real numbers in terms of dealing with the drug problem. In fact, pagdating kay President Duterte, we were not even sure saan niya kinukuha yung mga numero niya. Yung milyon-milyon daw na drug addicts, sino yung mga narco-politicians. In fact, the very basis of his claims about his drug war were questionable to begin with. And to be honest, hanggang ngayon, mystery pa rin sa atin saan galing yung kanyang drug list. Tignan natin yung kanyang drug war on multiple dimensions. Unang-una, saan yung mga big fish? Of course, when we say big fish, ito yung mga malalaking drug lords na dapat hinuli ni Digong nung panahon niya. But if you look at the actual data, halos kahit isang big fish, wala siyang nahuli. In fact, interestingly, some people would say he could have easily apprehended one of the big fishes who spent time with him at ang dami nilang pictures together. In fact, this person apparently was easily able to escape when push came to shove. So, sino talaga ang tinarget ng drug war ni Digong? If you look at it, ang tinarget talaga dito ay yung mga poorest of the poor Filipinos. In fact, the Catholic Church, civil society groups, human rights groups, ang tawag nila sa drug war ni Digong ay war on the poor. The numbers are very clear. Sa libo-libo na namatay sa alleged extrajudicial killings during Duterte's administration, halos lahat sa kanila, they belong to the poorest of poor Filipinos, and a lot of them were in the slum areas at saka yung mga mahihirap na lugar sa ating bansa. Very few big fish or celebrities, if any, were caught during Digong's time. And wag natin kalimutan, yung cases like Kian de los Santos, yung mga tao na kinota lang or sinama lang sa kota para lang may pakita ang administration when it comes to their drug war. Ang justification ng administration is nanlaban sila. But we know that a lot of these killings were under extremely suspicious circumstances. So hindi lang tinarget yung mga poorest of the poor Filipinos or small-time drug users, tinarget din ang mga inosenteng tao, including more than 100 children and minors according to some reports. So ano ba talaga yung drug war ni Rodrigo Duterte? For some experts, it was about politics of fear. Huwag natin kalimutan yung so-called narco list ni Pangulong Duterte, yung narco politician list. So according to Digong, ito yung mga politiko na supposedly involved in drug trafficking or drug use among other things. Pero kung titignan mo, hanggang ngayon hindi natin alam anong basis. Sino yung mga intelligence agencies or gaano ka-credible yung intelligence basis ng mga narco list na yan. If anything, the narco politician list was actually used as a weapon, as a political weapon para i-silence yung mga opposition, yung mga critics, and to create an overall climate of fear. In 2019, something unprecedented happened. Not a single member of the opposition made it to the Senate for the first time in more than 80 years. At isa sa mga pinakamalaking dahilan ay hindi lang disinformation, hindi lang yung usual advantages of the incumbency and the machine aspect of elections or command votes. Kasama din dyan yung sinasabi nila na threat of putting people on the narco list. Therefore, apparently, marami sa mga opposition candidates nahirapan sila maghanap ng mga LGU host dun sa kanilang mga campaign events. In many ways, yung narco-politician list ni Rodrigo Duterte made it extremely hard for the opposition to crystallize into an effective resistance force. The climate of fear was a big, big weapon for Duterte, and his drug war was very much at the center of that. Perhaps the most high-profile and controversial case kung saan na-weaponize yung drug war was targeting of top opposition leaders and critics of Rodrigo Duterte. Think about former Senator Leila de Lima, who spent more than half a decade behind bars on trumped-up charges. Speaking of trumped-up charges, alam natin towards the end of the Duterte administration, and as soon as Duterte stepped down, actually marami sa mga witnesses na yan, they recanted their testimonies against former Senator Leila de Lima. We know that the climate of fear even extended beyond the case of Senator de Lima. At some point, the administration did something crazy. They pretended that there are no documents proving that Senator Trillanes, back then still in the Senate and fighting back against Duterte, was ever pardoned for his coup d'etats or coup attempts against the government. Next thing you know, na-besiege pa yung Senado and there were attempts to arrest the senator while he was inside the Senate. Over the years, critics like former Senator Trillanes, former Senator De Lima, among others, were made example of. There's a Chinese saying that in order to scare the monkey, kill the chickens. In many ways, yun din ang ginawa ng Duterte administration. In fact, not only chickens, he went after senators of the Republic who dared to question his war on drugs and who dared to question his intentions behind his war on drugs. Overall, kung titignan natin yung drug war ni Digong, it really helped him in terms of creating a climate of fear, scaring the critics. Pero pagdating sa ebidensya na talaga we dealt with the problem of drugs and criminality, it's very hard to see how it was a success or even sincere to begin with. In fact, pag titignan mo yung mga surveys, more than 7 out of 10 Filipinos repeatedly said throughout the years na takot sila na maging biktima ng extrajudicial killings. In fact, majority of Filipinos in surveys also said that ayaw nila na ma-EJK yung mga alleged drug users or even drug peddlers. So while majority of Filipinos supported a drug war in theory, pagdating sa actual tactics ng Duterte administration, the Filipino people always had reservations. For human rights groups, and potentially for the International Criminal Court, it was more than just bad tactics or methodology. What happened was nothing less than crimes against humanity. Mass atrocities against fellow Filipinos by the former president of the Republic. Lest we forget, this is the same president who openly told the Philippine National Police na yun lang, patayin nyo lang yung mga criminals and he's gonna protect them no matter what. That was the climate of impunity and fear that Duterte's fake drug war inflicted upon the Filipino nation. And hanggang ngayon, we're still coping with its repercussions. Oh, and lest we forget, the current head of the CIDG in the Philippine National Police was very clear that actually, during the Digong's time, there were a lot of operations, marami namatay, maraming nanlaban daw, but actually sobrang konting nahuli mga droga. Compared to now that actually maybe the operations are definitely not as violent, not as frequent, pero yung nahuhuling droga ay much more. So in fact, the effectiveness of the campaign was very much under question too. So ang daming drug busts na nangyari, but their effectiveness was very much under question. And worse, it created a human rights catastrophe sa Pilipinas and emaciated any semblance of rule of law in the country. And in many ways, you could say the drug war was JPEGs, a big budol by the former president. Huwag natin kalimutan, isa sa mga pinakamalaking pangako ni former President Rodrigo Duterte when he ran for the highest office of the land was to fight against corruption. In fact, early on, he said even a whiff of corruption is not going to be tolerated by him. And in fairness to him, some people very close to him, including his spokesman during his presidential run, was relieved of his office when there was indeed some reports or suggestions of misdeeds, if not corruption. But Duterte's campaign against corruption is highly questionable if you look at the actual evidence. Unang-una, nagkaroon po tayo ng recycling on steroids. Maraming opisyales ng panahon ni Digong were relieved of their positions, were fired or forced to resign, and next thing you know, they were just reappointed in another departments. In fact, we have cases of certain individuals with questionable practices being repeatedly reappointed to different departments, which just tells you that their firing or resignation was more performative than realistic. Just like the drug war, it was about performance rather than substance. And pagdating sa corruption scandals, kailangan ba natin balikan yan? Remember, the scandals around DOH, Pharmali, COVID-19 expenditures of the government, some would say overpriced vaccines, the price of the PPEs, and all sorts of different anomalous activities that very much put into question the good governance claims of the former administration. So if you want to talk about the worst budget ever, pag-usapan natin how the budget during the pandemic was spent by the Duterte administration. Now, for some, that was just the tip of the iceberg. We can talk about millions and millions, if not billions, of dollars spent on all sorts of different small or medium-scale infrastructure projects. Speaking of corruption, or at least questionable practices, the Philippines spent billions of dollars dun sa mga flood control projects na clearly hindi effective as we saw with recent typhoons and inability of our infrastructure to cope with it. Guess what? A lot of that was spent during the 6 years of Rodrigo Duterte. So if you want to talk about effectiveness, you want to talk about questionable practices or questionable infrastructure projects, tignan natin ang nangyari sa mga flood control projects among other infrastructure projects during Digong's time. Well, recently, some people made a lot of noise around itong, of course, very unfortunate incident kung saan nag-collapse ang isang bridge sa Isabela. But let's not forget, these infrastructure projects take years to complete. And a big chunk of that project actually was implemented and almost completed during the Duterte administration. So there's no way we can talk about big infrastructure projects or any major infrastructure projects in recent years going wrong without looking at yung 6 years ni Digong when actually these projects were being implemented. And then of course, meron kang projects that never got off the ground. For instance, ano nangyari dun sa Mindanao Railway project ni Digong? Supposedly a way for him to push back against decades of Imperial Manila's neglect of Mindanao when it comes to basic infrastructure. Ano nangyari dun sa mga ibang projects, mga big-ticket infrastructure projects na build. Base sa mga datos na meron tayo from DPWH and other important sources, napakababa yung efficiency rates of completion of different infrastructure projects under the Duterte administration. And when it comes to traffic in Manila, last time I checked, the DPWH Secretary of Duterte, towards the end of his term, said that soon in Philippines, you can go from one point in Metro Manila to another point within 30 minutes to 45 minutes. Where last time I checked, it took me more than 2 hours to go from one side of Metro Manila to the other side this year. And it's already 2025. So kung titignan natin yung track record ng Duterte administration when it comes to infrastructure, corruption anomalies, well, it's not very encouraging. But what's most troubling is the invention of the so-called confidential fund by the Duterte dynasty. To be fair, may confidential fund din ang Aquino administration, but it was very limited under very strict conditions. Pero yung nakita natin sa Dutertes is this. The confidential fund actually goes back to their decades-old rule in Davao. And kung titignan mo, hindi lang si Rodrigo Duterte, who was enjoying billions and billions of confidential fund when he was president, pero pati yung mga anak niya, bilang mayor of Davao, was also enjoying one of the largest ever confidential funds in the country. So even though Davao is a much smaller city when it comes to its resources, let's say compared to Quezon City or Makati, tignan niyo naman yung confidential funds ni Sara Duterte when she was mayor of Davao. So if you want to talk about anomalies, you want to talk about misuse of funds or potential misuse of funds, tignan niyo naman yung track record ng mga Dutertes in terms of their confidential fund. Not only when Rodrigo Duterte was the president, but also when they became the overlords of Davao for decade after decade after decade. So well before the whole Mary Grace Piatos expose and the Quadcom hearings on Vice President Sara Duterte's practices or some would say malpractices in the Department of Education, actually, dapat titignan mo yung mga confidential funds practices ng Duterte dynasty throughout the decades and not only the 6 years of the Rodrigo Duterte presidency. In short, when it comes to the issue of governance, when it comes to the issue of corruption, wala masyadong moral ascendancy ang mga Dutertes or mga supporters nila to question any other administration. Especially an administration that came right after them and had to cope with the problems, the debt, and all sorts of anomalies that the previous administration left behind. In fact, wag natin kalimutan, lumobo yung ating utang nung panahon ni Digong. We kept on borrowing. Hindi siya bill. Borrow nangyari nung panahon ni Digong. And that was inevitably going to be a problem, not only for the succeeding administration, but for administrations to come. In fact, towards the end of the Duterte administration, you had no less than Department of Finance Secretary Sonny Dominguez openly saying that we could face a generational fiscal challenge. So in short, there's no way to talk about our ability to cope with different problems, to invest in our infrastructure, without also talking about the bad legacy of the Duterte administration when it comes to debt, when it comes to inefficient infrastructure spending, and not to mention yung quality ng mga infrastructure projects nila, among others. Oh, but speaking of Budol, ito isa sa mga paborito ko yan. Remember, Duterte also said early on na galit siya sa gambling. Bawal daw ang gambling sa kanya. And yet, next thing you see, nagdagsa ng mga pogos, Chinese pogos, nung panahon niya. From a few online Chinese casino operators in the Philippines back in the day, it exploded to unprecedented proportions. By some estimate, more than 100,000, if not hundreds of thousands, of folks from China flooded into the Philippines in order to work in suspicious pogo or online casinos all across the country. Next thing you know, there's an explosion of kidnapping. Next thing you know, there's an explosion of scamming. And worse, based on reports by some of the top senators and top officials back then, including former Senator Lacson, to sometimes even admissions by top security officials like former Secretary of Defense Lorenzana, not to mention former National Security Advisor General Esperon. All of them, in one way or another, also warned about the possibility of espionage and infiltration. And that's precisely why the Alice Go, or actually AKA Alice Go, accurately known as Go Huaping, is very important because it showed that it was during Duterte's time na talagang pumasok itong mga pogo na yan and nagkaroon ng mga questionable activities and potential infiltration by China's security services and intelligence services in the country. After all, how much of background check or proper scrutiny did we do of a lot of these pogos? In fact, one thing I noticed during the time that the pogos exploded was this. Marami sa kanila ay malapit doon sa mga strategic locations, including Camp Crame, Camp Aguinaldo, yung ating airbase. So it also raised some serious questions as to whether these were pogos that were just doing illegal criminal activities or something probably even worse and even more sinister. Now, just to be clear, not all the pogos were doing things that were wrong. And a lot of Chinese folks who actually ended up working there were just looking for better opportunities in life. But the reality is that black box yung pogo industry. Many things happened there that until now we are yet to fully uncover. And the Alice Go situation was just probably the tip of the iceberg. And this is one of the things that got very interesting. Nung panahon ni Digong, isa sa mga biggest critics of the pogo phenomenon was no less than the Chinese government. On multiple occasions, the Chinese embassy in the Philippines tried to encourage its own citizens not to get involved in this industry, and it tried to encourage the Philippine government to shutter or shut down the pogo industry. In fact, during one of Duterte's visit where he met President Xi Jinping, this is per admission of the former president himself, the paramount leader of China asked him, please shut down the pogos. This is bad for China. As you know, bawal ang gambling in China, and there are a lot of potential criminal syndicate groups also involved in this gambling. So the pogo explosion in the Philippines actually had negative repercussions back in China, so much so that their paramount leader, their embassy here, a lot of their top leaders had to ask Rodrigo Duterte to stop it. And yet, he said no. Why? Sabi niya daw may national interest. But what national interest? If you look at reports about tax evasion, if you look at the reports about money laundering, if you look at the reports about crimes, klarong-klaro na hindi ganun kaklaro yung national interest natin pagdating sa pogos. So let's be honest, who really benefited from the pogos when they were here, aside from their own Chinese operators. So when it comes to Duterte, Alice go, 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 go. Yan ang legacy ni Rodrigo Duterte, or at least a part of his Budol King legacy sa Pilipinas.